Hello. So I want to thank you all, first of all, for coming and welcome you to this LSU Press online book launch event. My name's Drew Flanagan. I am an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford in Bradford, Pennsylvania. Today I'm going to be talking about my new book, which is just out last month from LSU Press, From Occupation to Integration, Re-Civilizing the French Zone of Post-Nazi Germany, 1945 to 1955. Well, first of all, I guess I'll introduce myself, or I guess I already did. I gave you the basics, but I'm a historian of modern France and Germany. I also have an interest in the French colonial empire particularly North Africa, and some of the connections between colonial empire and European history, as you'll see in this talk. So let me jump into it. I will show just two slides at various points, basically just one for maps and one for a table of contents. Just to introduce the subject matter of the book. So between 1945 and 1955, France was one of four principal occupying powers in a defeated Germany, along with its British, American, and Soviet allies. France was responsible for among other things, the so-called 4Ds of Allied policy toward Germany: denazification, democratic re-education, decartelization, and demilitarization. And I will maybe allude to some of those later on, but we're going to see that the French have a unique approach to some of these things. For the French, it's also a reversal of situations. France was defeated by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in June of 1940, and France was then occupied by the Axis powers for much of the war. And so this is a reversal of situations for the French, which changes what occupation means to them to some degree. France emerges from the Second World War as a diminished power. And I think this is important to be aware of. For French leaders, reasserting France's great power status in Europe and its leadership in both Europe and the world are priorities and are related to the French approach to occupation as well. They're also interested in addressing problems with German society, culture, and politics, what they understand to be Nazi barbarism and the uncivilized aspects of German culture. So what I argue in the book, broadly speaking, I'm going to go through some portions of it, but is that France has a unique approach to occupation, which is informed in all of its aspects, in its political aspects, in its cultural aspects, and even in its economic aspects, by what I call civilizational thinking, ideas about civilization and civilizations. Re-civilizing the French zone, which is a term that I borrow from the German historian Konrad Jarosch, but this re-civilizing process from the perspective of the French zone entails transforming the Germans themselves and eventually making them into pacified, civilized partners for France in a revitalized and unified Western Europe. So this is, as we'll see from the map in a moment, this is a borderland story. This is a story about the land border between France and Germany, which is where this occupation occurs. But it also has implications for our understanding of the process of European integration and the Cold War and decolonization. So on that note, I'm going to just quickly show you a couple of maps. Hopefully you can see that. Just to get a sense of where we are in the world. So on the right there, you see a map of the occupied zones of Germany circa late 1945. And you can see the British zone in the northwest, the American zone in the south, the Soviet zone in the east, and the French zone down here in the southwest of Germany, all along the Franco-German border. And then we have a zoomed in map of the French zone itself, showing the provinces that made it up. And also the Rhine River is not as clearly visible on here, but it's sort of snaking down down here and then becomes the Franco-German border in the southern half of the French zone. So the French zone has this odd shape, this sort of hourglass-like shape. So it's the smallest of the four Allied zones, and that's important. But at the same time, it is also more significant than its size would suggest because of its role as a borderland. It includes some important territories. Some portions of it are on what's known as the left bank of the Rhine, basically the western side of the Rhine, or from a French nationalist perspective, the French side of the Rhine. Some of them are on the right bank of the river, but it's right across from Alsace and Lorraine, the famous French border provinces, and includes large portions of the Black Forest. It includes the basin of the Moselle, and a big portion of the Rhine. So I want to talk a little bit about where this book came from. Why did I decide to write it? And it might not surprise you that it started out during my doctoral work at Brandeis University. Um, I spent about 2 years in French and German archives, including the archives of the French military government in Germany. And while I was in there, I started to notice certain linguistic patterns, uses of certain terms that ended up sort of flipping a switch for me and making me think, what does this mean? Why is this being used in this context? Language about prestige, language about French radiance, le rayonnement de la France, the radiance of France, cultural influence. So a lot of this language has ideological resonances. It also, some of it has colonial roots or was developed in relation with the French colonial project abroad. So that suggested something that I later found to be true. One of the centers of this book is looking at how a notion of France as a civilizing power plays a role in France's approach to Germany, and also plays a role for some of the Germans who decide to work with France to support its project in Southwest Germany. So I want to say a little bit about this idea of civilizational thinking, since it's sort of a load-bearing concept for me. There's lots of scholarly work that's been done on the idea of civilization. But for practical purposes, I divide French civilizational thinking around the French zone into two aspects. One of them is the idea that the world is made up of civilizations, that it's divided into these major cultural groupings that share history, that share culture, oftentimes share religious values. Some nations, in accordance with this first aspect, this sort of spatial aspect of people belonging to civilization, some nations have a choice about which civilization to align themselves with, according to this pattern of thought. And the second aspect of civilizational thinking I'm talking about here is ideas about the civilizing process. How do people become civilized, or in this case, perhaps re-civilized? And this also is linked to ideas about what it means to civilize a foreign person, a foreign people, which often have colonial connections. So how was this present in each area of the French occupation? This is sort of where I started out in terms of my chapters. So I'm going to go through each of the chapters. I'm going to show you the table of contents and talk a little bit about what's going on in each of these chapters, and show how this civilizational thinking is present in each of them. So the first chapter of this book is entitled Force and Prestige, and it looks at the invasion and occupation of what becomes the French zone, both by the French military and by its American and British allies, and the pacification of the French zone. So pacification is a term of art here, referring to certain approaches to counterinsurgency work and sort of making the zone peaceful, making the German population of the zone peaceful. This involves taking stock of the German population, their mentalities and their loyalties, their attitudes toward France. It also entails taking stock of France's recent defeat in 1940 and France's changed position in the world and its position relative to other European powers and the Germans. And so this means for French military leaders addressing what they see as the defeated mentality of their soldiers, overcoming this sense of maybe even inferiority vis-a-vis Germans that they have to overcome in order to exercise domination over this German population. They are influenced in this process by a theory of pacification developed by Marshal Hubert Lyautey, who was a French general. He was the first French resident general in the Protectorate of Morocco starting in 1912, a big hero of empire. Described by Ed Berenson in that way, and also a military intellectual who developed this approach to pacifying conquered territory that's a forerunner of a lot of coined, counterinsurgency theory today. And so the application of the Lyauteian strategy to the French zone is one of the centers of that chapter. Pacification in the Lyauteian sense is understood as part of a larger civilizing process, the first step of bringing a population under the influence of French civilization. Chapter 2 continues sort of in this vein. It's called France Restored and Tutelary, and it looks at what I call the sense of mission of officers of the French military government and how it is linked to ideas about civilization and civilizing, both about German civilization, French civilization, and the civilizing process and how those things come together. So French civilizational thinking around their zone during the 1945 to 49 period, when the military government is dominant, is concerned with older ideas about German civilization, including this idea of two Germanys, the idea that there's one Germany, a Western, more Catholic, more liberal in the sense of individual liberties, but also in the sense of free trade Germany that's maybe more compatible with France, and then an Eastern, an Oriental Germany. This idea of Occident and Orient is important here. The Occident, the Christian West on one hand, which one part of Germany is closer to, and then an Eastern Germany centered around Prussia, in the northeast of Germany, the Iron Kingdom, which is supposedly more Eastern culturally, closer to the Orient, closer to Slavic Eastern Europe. And you can see the beginning of some of this sort of ethnocultural logic that's going into French occupation. This chapter 2 also looks at the role of civilization, so-called civilizational German studies, of the field of psychology of peoples, in how the French authorities developed their understanding of the people that they were occupying and how to influence them, how to bring them closer to French civilization. So this idea of there being two Germanys, one more compatible with France, one less compatible with France, is going to persist through the Cold War, as you might expect. But in this, we can also see the influence of this idea of France as a tutelary power, as a power that civilizes. It's built into the democratic re-education strategy of France and other things as well. So I'm happy to talk about that in more depth. Chapter 3 is Vive la France, Vive la Lande, which is a quotation from a German woman who is writing to the Administrator General of the French military government, Émile Lafon. And she's applying, actually, doing a couple things in this letter where she uses this expression. So hooray for France, hooray for our land, for our state, our home federal state in Germany. And so this idea of this title sort of expresses this alignment between regionalism and sort of pro-French feeling. So chapter 3 looks at the Francophiles, people that the French administration called Francophiles, pro-French Germans. I mean, I think we have a sense in our minds of what a Francophile is, someone who is a fan of French culture, someone who likes French wine or Impressionist painting. And that could be an aspect of what was going on, but it's not the whole story. Excuse me. So basically, a Francophile for the French authorities means a German who agrees with France's project for southwestern Germany, and the orientation of their home provinces toward France and toward the West, toward this idea of a Christian West, of an Occident. So I'm really interested in what the motivations were of these pro-French Germans, what they thought they were doing, what their own projects were they simply a lot of these people serve as intermediaries for France. Intermediary is a term that's used a lot in colonial history. The go-betweens, people who administer Germany on France's behalf, people who, this could be elites, people who are appointed as mayors or ministers, president, governors more or less of the states by France, especially in the first 2 years of the occupation. And they could also be, um, excuse me, they could also be ordinary people. They could be translators or police officers, people in positions of trust. And so the French prefer Francophiles for various reasons, because they're viewed as more trustworthy, but also because they support this larger project and often share a civilizational vision with the occupation authorities. Um, so a lot of these folks, these German Francophiles, are Catholics. This is a more Catholic part of Germany, and this is an important part of how France is looking at Germany as maybe divisible or having more pro-French portions. A lot of them, I would say all of them would qualify as what you'd call federalists. They believe in a decentralized vision of Germany, maybe more autonomy for their home province or state, or for their sub-ethnic group like the Swabians, or we can get into that if you want to. They're some of them are even separatists. Some of them even want their home provinces to be separated from Germany permanently, and perhaps combined with France, or perhaps split off into some sort of buffer state, like a Rhine state, like what was discussed after World War One. So looking at the pro-French Germans, looking at their role in this re-civilizing project. So chapter 4, from reparations to integration. This one is sort of focused on the French economic strategy toward their zone, which, as we'll see, is closely linked to this civilizing vision as well. And so here we also see a potential transfer of colonial experience, because the French approach to the German economy of their zone was described by Konrad Jarosz, who's one of the leading, not Konrad Jarosz, I'm sorry, one of the leading German historians of this subject, Reino Hudemann, as mise en valeur, as an instance of mise en valeur, which is a French colonial economic strategy, which involves selectively redeveloping a territory's economy to benefit France, basically to complement France's own economy. And so this chapter traces the French economic approach from through 3 stages, starting with reparations. So after World War II, Germany owes reparations to the Allies and to victims of German aggression, just as it had after World War I. And this is a big part of Allied economic policies toward Germany. But even in the first year or two of the occupation, when collecting reparations is central to the French project, there's already talk about orienting the region's economy toward France permanently. And this orientation project involves this selective redevelopment of German territory. So this transfer of experience, this idea of mise en valeur, maybe you can see this as imperialist, and I think it is to a point. But I think what's really important about this period is that you can see actual transborder economic integration occurring between France and its Southwest German occupied zone and the Saarland, which is sort of treated semi-separately. And I can get into that more if you're interested. But this region is being incorporated into France's plans for its own economic recovery, especially after 1946 under the Monet Plan for the modernization of the French economy. So the assumption behind this French economic plan is that they will have German resources, German markets, even German manufactured goods to support France's recovery. And so this economic orientation, though, is also linked to ideas about influence, ideas about how to reach the Germans. And there's this quotation in one of these internal documents. One of these French administrators says, the missionary must follow the trading post. If we want to influence the borderlands Germans, we have to align their economic interests with those of France. So to do that, we will undertake this project of orientation, which involves building infrastructure and redirecting the economy of the zone toward France. So this also eventually leads into a 3rd stage, from reparations to orientation to European integration as we know it today, starting with the Schuman Plan and the Treaty of Paris in 1951. So how do you get from occupation, a sort of imperialist economic policy, to European integration and the EU? So happy to talk about that more too. But chapter 5 is called Conquerors and Tourists. And this is sort of the social history chapter, looking at interactions between French and German people on the ground in the French zone. So French have a very large number of people compared to their allies within their zone. About 18 French for every 1,000 Germans at the height, which is quite a large percentage. And so this means people have to live side by side who have different, who were recently on opposite sides of the war. And so what I look at in this chapter is conflicts over space and resources. Naturally, these are going to occur when people are sharing space, and there's the straitened circumstances of after the war and the destruction of the war, which affects, standards of living and everything else. But I'm really interested in conflicts over urban space, housing, buildings, rural land use. Also the practices that people in the zone, because this is a largely rural zone, um, practices that people undertake to survive, which start to take on a political valence because they become even something like poaching or illegal recuperation of goods or black marketeering or these other things that people do under occupation are going to take on a political valence because as a sort of resistance or restating German sovereignty, German control over land and resources. And then later in the occupation, especially between 1949 and 55, after West Germany emerges as its own country, this reassertion of German sovereignty involves things like pushing for derequisitioning of buildings that are held by the French occupier, basically pushing for an end to the occupation. And a reassertion also of sort of West Germany's equality with France, the idea that fine, let's integrate with one another, but not on the basis of West Germany becoming a French satellite. And so, and finally, chapter 6 takes a step back. It is looking at the imaginative process by which French authorities and French soldiers and people in the French zone came to accept or began to come to accept West Germany as being readmitted into the Occident, into this Christian West, a sort of French-centered vision of Western European unity in the context of the Cold War. And of course, focusing on the period really from 49 to 55. And one of the things that I'm interested there is how does this older idea, this 18th century Enlightenment idea of the two Germanys, how does this play into the eventual division of Germany into East and West Germany, of course, but into sort of French acceptance of that. And you can see this continuing ethnocultural logic about who is compatible with France civilizationally, who belongs within this, and increasing othering of East Germans as being more Eastern, more Oriental, closer to the Slavic Eastern Europe and to another civilization. So this continued sort of imaginative process of defining Germany's really complicated relationship to the West and its civilizational identity. And so part of the conditional re-inclusion of Southwest Germany in the West during this period, I argue, is also asking Southwest Germans to support France's colonial mission, particularly during the 1946 to 54 First Indochina War, French Indochina War. This is something that's promoted to the German population as France is standing up for the democratic world, but also as France is continuing its civilizing mission, right? It's bringing its indispensable, unique ability to civilize to the world. And I should mention just in passing that French then becomes a major center also of recruitment for the French Foreign Legion. Many of the soldiers that will serve under French colors in Indochina are recruited from among the German and Austrian populations. And so Boundaries of the West is really about this sort of rethinking of Western Germany. It's conditional acceptance into this Western alliance, which involves a civilizational rethinking. And so we also see a specifically Western European version of the kind of clash of civilizations logic that we often hear connected to the Cold War, the idea that it's a clash between ways of life or between East and West. What does that mean to Western Europeans? So just to sum up, I want to talk about what I see as some of the biggest takeaways of this book. I would much rather take questions from you all than to keep talking. And plus, I keep sniffling, so trying to minimize that. So like I said, this was a book about, I guess you could say, the conditional reintegration of a particular part of Germany into an imagined united Western civilization or Western European civilization. Um, it has implications for the history of the European Unity Project and our understanding of where it's going next, particularly the role of civilizational thinking in the creation of a united Europe after World War II, the role of empires and of great powers in shaping what united Europe would look like. Um, it has implications also for understanding of the post-war international system that comes out of 1945, institutions like the United Nations, but also NATO and, of course, European institutions. And I guess people will often question whether old nationalist and imperialist habits were abandoned in favor of those things. And I think I point to some nuances there. This is a story that links colonial history and European history. It doesn't try to equate them in any way, and certainly there are large differences in terms of how some of these practices, mise en valeur or pacification, or other practices that I talk about are applied to a European population. But the fact that they are, I think, is important. And what I really think I'm pointing to is that there's a shared background of civilizational thinking that's at work in both places, in the colonized world and in Europe during this period in the mid 20th century. That's informing both the colonial civilizing mission and how Europeans relate to one another. And I think that that's crucial to understand. Um, Europeans' ideas about their own civilization have for a very long time been tied to their thinking about non-European others, especially Asians and Africans. And we can see that in this story as well. I'm happy to expand on that if you're interested. Um, this story has implications for European identity. I mean, looking at the different things that European unity has meant to people over time, I think is important. It has implications for immigration, people coming from outside of Europe, coming to Europe, and the challenges that they have often faced and continue to face, I think appear a little bit differently in light of all of this. Um, there has been, and also the integration of Eastern Europeans, the so-called New Europe in the early 2000s into European institutions, was also colored by this sort of civilizational uh, logics and language. And we've seen a resurgence of civilizationist language in international relations recently, including very strong Occidentalist sort of religio-cultural ideas about who is in and who is out of the West. And so I think a lot of this is very timely in that way. I think whenever we engage in civilizational thinking or use the language of civilization, we should be aware that that logic implies both exclusions. Some people have to be outside of a civilization for it to exist, and also notions about the civilizing process. How do people become civilized? I think we should take that seriously. So thanks for listening to my little presentation, and I'm happy to answer your questions, talk to you. I think Corey Calabria from LSU Press is going to be actually taking the questions and then passing them on to me. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Drew. I'm actually so excited to talk about this book. Drew, can you stop sharing your screen for a minute here?
Yes, I meant to do that a while ago.
Yeah, also want to thank everyone for tuning in and for the comments that you've had so far, which I will relay it to Drew because as I mentioned in the chat, he can't see your comments, and I think it's always helpful to know that someone is there. So thank you, Banaz, Lauren, and Sue for your congratulations. If you have a question for Drew, like he mentioned, please just put it in the chat and we will ask away. There's a lot of fascinating things to talk about here and I'm not quite sure where to start. So um, let's just talk maybe about maybe the research or the writing of the book just to start something general. Can you talk about something that surprised you either while conducting research or writing from occupation to integration?
I think that surprised me. Well, I mean, I think I've already kind of shared it, but I'm happy to kind of dig into it a little bit more. I mean, I started out this subject essentially because when I came to graduate school, I really was hardly aware that there had been a French zone of occupation at all, and I was sort of surprised. I wouldn't say surprised. Surprised is too strong, but I didn't take for granted. That it had existed or what it had meant to France. And so immediately when I began to dig into it, my first question was psychological. What did it mean, this reversal of situations? What did it mean to become an occupier in the country of the people who had just recently occupied you? Um, and so I was interested in rhetoric and language and what did they think they were doing, right? I kind of identify a little bit with what's known as the new cultural history, this idea of, the history of mentalities, as they call it in France. And so this, like, what did people think they were doing? And so I was interested in how this might differ, both in the sense of having to contend with particular challenges, challenges in having your authority respected by Germans who might see you as, not legitimate occupiers, and I deal with that a lot in chapter 5, but also dealing with maybe your own complexes about Germany and about occupation, but also dealing with the challenges France is facing on a larger scale. Its impoverishment because of the German occupation and the looting that had occurred in France between 1940 and 45. The destabilization of France's colonial empire, which is a huge challenge because France is only really able to pretend to great power status after the war because its empire is nominally intact. So anyway, and in the research, I mean, I was drawn to language that suggested what people were thinking about what they were doing, and so this I started out by chasing the thread of prestige and what did prestige mean to them, and how, because obviously, I mean, right, you see prestige and you say, well, I would suspect that prestige would be something they would be worried about. And so then I started to see other language in connection with prestige. But it really was a matter of following this thread and trying to understand what is the sense of mission? What does this occupying force understand to be its job? And it was only later that I started to connect it to all sorts of other areas, the actual military conquest, the approach to the economy, the approach to democratic re-education and propaganda, as I sort of went through. So I guess you could say I was surprised there was a French zone, although I wasn't quite surprised, but I knew there was a French zone, but I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't really considered what that meant. And then I was surprised to see language that really kind of immediately smacked to me as having civilizing mission resonances. And people who have a background in French colonial history will know how much of a thing that is for French colonial history. But in any case, yeah, that's an attempt.
We've got some great questions here from Susie, Gabriel, and Peter. Thank you all for asking them. I'm going to start with you, Susie. Susie asks, was there re-civilization happening with other countries after the end of Nazi reign?
Yeah, so actually, I addressed this briefly in the introduction. So Christopher Knowles is a historian of the British zone of occupation, and he has commented on what he calls the moral crusade aspects of the British sort of sense of mission. And so his work is sort of more of like a collective biography of a group of particular um, occupying, both like administrators and military leaders. And so this idea also of maybe that this is a version of imperial trusteeship in the British Empire sense. So this idea that it's something kind of like, or even like a League of Nations mandate, right? The idea that we're temporarily taking over in order to bring people up to the level to govern themselves. So that is present in the British zone. Um, I think what differs about how I'm talking about civilizational thinking is that I think that there are also, in addition to some of these transfers of maybe ideas about the civilizing process that you also see in the British zone, there's also this long French history of thinking about Germany in terms of civilization and belonging to two civilizations at once somehow, or being internally having two souls. And so I wanted to find a way to bring those two things together to think about how specifically this history of Franco-German rivalry was present and also this transfer of experience. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's great, definitely. We've got another question here from Gabriel, who also sends his congratulations. Gabriel asks, how permeable was the French-German border throughout the occupation? And there's a follow-up question here. What about the border between the French occupation zone and its neighboring Allied zones? How did that affect life in the zone as either a French soldier or a German civilian?
Oh, that's a very good question. Okay, so the permeability of the French-German border, um, I mean, there's always some permeability because there aren't enough troops to patrol the entire border. This is a rural zone. It's heavily forested in portions. Obviously, crossing the river is one thing. Most of the bridges are destroyed in the war, so there is some sort of illicit movement of people. We have to, I guess, to really get at this question, because I don't know if I can answer it satisfyingly, except for to say, to get at this question, we have to think about the status of early post-war Germany and really Europe in general. Millions of people are on the move. The so-called displaced persons, many of which are former forced laborers or camp inmates, right? These larger like refugees, even internally displaced people within Germany or escaping from bombings or trying to get home, having already fled the bombings, right? You think about how many people are in motion. There is going to be a certain amount of permeability. Gaining control over the population is a very important goal of all of the occupying militaries. And I think this idea of pacification, and one of the things I talk about in chapter one, is that this idea of pacification is really linked to that. How do we get control over the population? How do we figure out who's there, identify them? So a big part of chapter one is talking about ratissage, this practice of where the army basically sweeps through the forested areas of the zone, just looking for people who might be hiding out. Some of these people are, war criminals or otherwise, wanted. Some of them are just doing what they call banditry or just, they don't have like an official status. But this practice of ratissage, this raking over, verifying everyone's identity papers is very much also used in the French colonial empire. And it's linked to this idea of getting control over the population, getting a handle on who's there. And there's a contradiction between wanting to identify everyone, wanting to check everyone's papers, and wanting to say defeat a possible German underground resistance or something like that. These are sort of different projects, but ultimately the French strategy really favors the former, that going after and identifying everyone. In terms of permeability between the Allied zones, there's a really stringent efforts to control it, especially in like the first 2 years. Couple things to think about. Uh, One of the things is that each zone has its own economy with its own economic rules. Early on, over the first couple, like 2 years of the occupation, the Allied Control Council is working to coordinate economic policies across the zones, and eventually this results in the bizone agreement between the British and American zones, and then the trizone 48, early 49. They're basically negotiating to unite their economies because that means different at various times different currencies are in use and things like that. So once again, I think there's the intentions of the occupiers to control the movement of people, and there's what they're actually capable of doing. But a lot of the day-to-day work of occupation is just trying to get a handle on people and keep them from being out of place.
I want to get to a question of my own actually, because what you said makes me think about it. And then I'm going to get to your great question, Peter, and also your question, Jenna. Thanks again, everyone, for your participation. It means a lot. So yeah, just because you mentioned ratissage, I am interested a little bit in kind of as I understand that, it's kind of like it's a colonial term, right? It was used in like the French occupation of Algeria as well, right?
Yeah, so it's actually a number of things. Originally, it's a police concept, right? Originally, it's as far as I can tell, and I haven't really delved into it, but it seems to me that it starts out as a police idea. It's the idea of roundups, right? Roundups of suspects. And you'll see it referred to even in like, old, Clouseau, like, films about policing, the sort of pre-proto noir kind of films. And it's used to control immigrant populations too. I mean, thinking of like Mary Lewis's work on the boundaries of the Republic. She talks about, and guest workers and things like that, right? The contrôle d'identité, right? The checking your identity papers is something that immigrant populations constantly undergo in France even today. Um, but it's also, yeah, it's also a pacification practice. Ratissage, so the really good example of this is in May 1945 in French Algeria. There are some incidents around the towns of Sétif and Guelma that turn into massacres by the French army and police. Basically, VE Day, May 8th, 1945. There's celebrations of the victory, but there are also some Algerian nationalist demonstrations, and the French authorities decide to crack down and try to arrest all the nationalists. And they bring in some of these Pieds Noirs, some of these European settlers in Algeria to be involved in it, and the army and police. But it starts out as ratissage. They just go and sweep through these areas looking for anybody who's out of place, sort of indiscriminately accusing people of being Algerian nationalists, and it results in massacres, thousands of people, but it starts out, it's like a police mission, and I think with colonial pacification and with counterinsurgency in general, there's frequently a kind of confusion between, are we policing or are we fighting an enemy in a war sense? You see what I mean?
Right,
Um,
right.
but but yeah, but it does have this career, and these links to this longer history of French counterinsurgency that goes back to China and Madagascar in the 1880s and 90s.
I'm curious if any early post-colonialists like Frantz Fanon ever commented on the post-Nazi occupation of Germany, and if they did, what did they have to say about it?
I would love to know that if I yeah, I have no idea. And I haven't seen any reference to it, but I do think that, I mean, Fanon certainly had interesting things to say about European civilization and this idea of this idea of its superiority. So I'd be fascinated to see that too.
I'm going to get to your question, Peter. Peter asks, what sort of memory is there in contemporary France of their occupation zone? Does it come up much?
No, I mean, I guess the easy answer is not a whole lot. I think that the memory is much more alive in Germany, and especially in the part that was occupied, which maybe shouldn't surprise us. Um, my impression from looking at the historiography, right, the approaches that have been taken to French versus German uh, history writing on this subject, is that French history writing tends to emphasize um, the um, I guess sort of like positive contributions of the occupation to things like Franco-German rapprochement, improvement of relations and things like that. But also there is some focus on like the cultural project. There's been a lot done on the like Corinne de France's work and things like that. On the German side, for a long time in the 80s and 90s, there's this book by Theodor Eschenburg where he says the French zone was an exploitation colony. Right. And so this is part of what informed my approach as I saw this. And then in the 90s, you see a sort of revisionist school of German historians, people like Edgar Wolfram and things like that, who are saying, well, it wasn't all bad, right? They helped to revive the labor movement in Germany. They democratized their part of Germany, right? It wasn't, but there was this sense that it had been very, I think Wolfram calls this the picture of a gloomy French time. He has an article about this. I think French memory I think it's really outweighed by Well, one of the ideas is this idea that it was like a place where a lot of like Vichy regime sort of people were like sort of put out of the way after the war. This the idea of Vichy and Baden-Baden, which I think like I remember who wrote about that. But so that's kind of present. But I think just like France's own recent occupation and all the other crises that France was dealing with at the time, it just doesn't quite rate with those.
I'm going to get to a couple questions here from Jenna. Jenna wants to know, hear more about how this occupation compared to or interacted with the other occupied zones. And I'm going to guess that that is the occupied zones here from Soviet Union, the US, and Britain.
Yeah, so for comparison's sake, so the French have the, like I mentioned, they have the largest relative presence in terms of people. Um, Part of this, there are a couple of reasons for this. One of them is, and usually in the past, people have emphasized the reason why is because France is impoverished after the war, and the soldiers and civilians involved in the occupation are able to live off of these payments that the German states pay for the occupation, the frais d'occupation anyway, right? The costs of the occupation. And so people have said sort of that this might be part of the motive, that it's basically a way to put some French population somewhere, and that actually like the rations that the French were receiving in Germany were higher than the average ration in France immediately after the war. You have to think about how chaotic things are in France. In fact, the Eisenhower wanted to occupy France for a while after D-Day, right? Just to give you an idea. But so that's one difference. But another reason why they do that is because of this idea, this Leontaian pacification, I would argue, this idea that they need to have an overwhelming initial show of force to sort of discourage the Germans from resisting them. And I actually have like a telegram from General Delattre to de Gaulle, to the prime minister of the provisional government, saying we need more troops because we need to show, we need to give this convincing show of force at the beginning. Um, so it's the smallest zone, but it is, I think it's sort of more important to France than, say, the British zone is to Britain, in the sense that France has a land border with Germany. So this is about securing its border. That's something that Soviets to a degree also have these concerns. I mean, they gained some territory. You can see it on that map from Germany out of this in East Prussia. Um, from the German perspective, French were seen fairly negatively during this period. And some scholars even said, well, they saw them as like second only to the Soviets in terms of how abusive they were. This sort of very, very negative vision, partially because the French do try to make their occupation pay in various ways, not just through collecting reparations, but also through this strategy of orientation. And so there's a perception among the Germans, which isn't completely incorrect, that France is sort of maybe exploiting the zone and but also maybe some of these attitude things, this French sort of preoccupation with prestige and the need to sort of force that one of these French officers says, we need to force the respect of the Germans. you know so if you're trying to force people's respect, that's going to affect things. I think this psychological aspect of being a little insecure conquerors, I think is something that also sets the occupation apart. I'm sure there are others, but over the course of the occupation, British, French, and American policy starts to converge. France is not as powerful as its two Western allies and is under a lot of pressure to kind of, you know, uh, I don't know, coordinate with them.
I've got two or three questions left on my end here. And so this is my last call for everyone that's tuning in. If you would like to ask something for Drew, put it in the chat now and we'll ask. We're gonna be out of here by the end of the hour. So yeah, we have enough time, I think, for one more question. So ask away if you've got anything on your mind. There's something you actually talked about earlier that sat with me that I'd love to talk about more or just learn more about, which was that at the end of your overview of chapter 4, you mentioned the European Union, and later you're talking about New Europe, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about both of these things in the context of civilizational thinking.
Yeah. So it's complicated, right? So what I'm talking about here is a certain idea of the West, which is not universally accepted even at the time, right? You have ideas about Western civilization, very broadly speaking. Sort of two main ones that are active, let's say in 1945 in Western Germany. One of them is sort of the liberal West. And I think that's kind of what we're used to in the United States. This idea of the West as the place of constitutionalism, as the place of uh, civil liberties or sort of individual liberty, at the place of capitalism and free trade and right this sort of the liberal West. And that is never totally absent. In fact, why part of this two Germanies concept was already in the 18th century, the idea that there's something a little more entrepreneurial and more liberal about the culture of like Rhenish Germany than the rest. And I'm thinking of like Jonathan Sperber's like Rhineland Radicals, or this stuff about like the emergence of like the liberal and Republican movements around 1848. Um, at the same time, there is this like culturalist, conservative, and kind of religiously based idea of Occident, right? Of Occidents from the Latin or the Western administrative division of the Roman Empire. It is this it's sort of I guess you could say a harder and a more cultural notion of a West. And this is, I think, side by side and often intertwined with this other idea. And so with the European Union, I mean, obviously, I don't want to make a historical leap from this period to that period that flattens it all out. But with the European Union, I would say, I was like, if I was going to put a pundit hat on for a moment, that it is faced by that contradiction now to some degree, that these do sometimes contradict each other. These two ideas of what it is to be Western or Western European or European. Is the EU a Western thing? From the beginning, the Schuman Plan is open to any European power. In theory, Poland could have joined if it, had wanted to transgress, its relationship with the Soviet Union, right? Much like the Marshall Plan, U.S. Financial aid to Europe in 1948, 49, was theoretically available to all Europeans. So you could say, well, it was never meant to just be for the West. And yet you have this little Europe of six out of the 1951 Treaty of Paris, which is all Western European countries. And I mean, even someone told me this once, that the imagery on the European Union flag, the circle of stars, has a Catholic resonance, has to do with, I think, the crown of the Virgin Mary. I might be getting this wrong, but there is sort of, it's in there, this idea that this is sort of a civilizational community from early on. What does that mean for us today? I don't want to seem to be suggesting that that's the more authentic version of Europe, right? Quite the contrary. I do think we see the resurgence of that idea that you need this cultural compatibility, that you have to act Western to be Western, right? Oftentimes, as I said, deployed against immigrant communities and other things like that, but also deployed to suggest some sort of deeper correspondence among Western European powers. Um, but yeah, this new Europe, I mean, these many of them post-socialist states, right? That joined in like 2005, the EU. There are some polemics at that time about, well, do these people have the right culture, right? And what does that mean? So they have faced some similar. So I guess what I'm interested in, or what I think is important for thinking about European unity from this story, is to think critically about what this idea of like cultural unity has meant, the violence that it has involved, and so on.
That's fascinating, and I actually think that's a great place to stop our conversation. I wanted to thank you one more time for being with us, Drew, and thank everyone for tuning in. And I'd like to remind everyone that pinned to the bottom of the chat is a 40% off discount code. So if you have not bought Drew's book yet, please do so now at this great price. Before we go, Drew, I wanted to ask you if you would mind telling us a little bit about what you're working on next.
Oh, well, I don't know. I have ideas. I have vague notions. I'm up for tenure next year, so that's really the real answer. Is I'm mostly working on that. I have some ideas about this idea of influence, this idea of radiance as getting beyond sort of a division between sort of hard and soft power. This is sort of an article project I've been working on for a while. Eventually, one day. I'd like to do a larger history of the Rhine borderlands in the modern era, maybe from like the late 19th to mid 20th centuries. Thinking about this region as sort of um, applying some of the insights that we see in Eastern European history around the shattered zone of empires, around the instability of borders and their constructedness to Western Europe. But that's going to take a few years to get off the ground. So thanks for asking, though.
I want to thank you too one more time for being here with us and for everyone for tuning in. Before we go, Drew, anything else you'd like to say to everyone watching?
Just thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate your support.
All right, y'all. Until next time, thank you.